Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. Thank you for joining me on this live stream entitled Emmanuel Levinas, Jean-Luc Marion, Phenomenology, and Interreligious Dialogue. So this is a title that includes several topics that aren't usually coming together with frequency. But I want to bring these topics together, bringing commentary from my 2021 book, Emmanuel, Levinas and Variations on God with Us, Chapter 1, entitled Avatars of Alterity. And toward the end of the chapter, it gets into interreligious dialogue. So I want to invite you to think along with me on these topics in phenomenology, themes that I've been developing for some years now, and bringing together multiple insights across the history of the method of phenomenology, and in particular today, thinking about the dialectical phenomenology that opens between Levinas and Marion, both of their work put together. What is this phenomenology when we combine forces of quite different angles in the method? So we want to talk about this. And to begin, I might just summarize how I might understand both the work of Levinas and Marion. So, with Jean-Luc Marion, he carries on the long-standing tradition in phenomenology of what I would call phenomenology of manifestation. So that's a key term for phenomenology. Manifestation, related to that Greek verb phino, to appear, to show itself. The phenomenon is what manifests itself to the human subject. But the manifestation in relation to what's emphasized in the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, manifestation in relation to proclamation. So these two things together, manifestation, proclamation. Within the history of phenomenology, we observe a kind of cleavage here between these two schools of phenomenology, where the road diverges, we could say. But what we want to look at together in this live stream is how these two things relate to each other, especially concerning interreligious dialogue. They're definitely not the same thing, manifestation and proclamation. Quite different approaches to phenomenality. On the manifestation side of things, we have an emphasis on givenness, the phenomenological concept of givenness, whereas in proclamation, it's a focus more on hermeneutics or interpretation of the phenomena that give themselves. But for Levinas, he tends to use the language of not so much givenness, but signification, which is coming out of this predilection for interpretation. So we're thinking about this relationship, careful relationship between manifestation and proclamation. In my 2017 book, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist, I get at this relationship extensively. And this distinction was first made by Paul Ricoeur in an essay entitled Manifestation and Proclamation, published in his book, Figuring the Sacred. And then David Tracy, in his book, The Analogical Imagination, picks up on this theme and thinks about it at more length applied to theology. But what we want to observe here in the work of Levinas, this phenomenology of proclamation, Marion, phenomenology of manifestation, is how they're different and yet approaching different religious traditions, how we can bring together the best of both worlds to understand Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Shintoism, these major world religions. How can we understand them according to this dialectic of religious expression, which is also showing up in philosophy? The difference between manifestation and proclamation. So again, Jean-Luc Marion, manifestation, givenness; Emmanuel, Levinas, proclamation, interpretation, which leads to ethics. Another distinction we might make here is between contemplation and ethics, or maybe more broadly, theory, and praxis, practice. So these are the distinctions we see across the history of philosophy globally. And we want to see this at work in different religious traditions. So I'm going to share again some excerpts and commentary from my 2021 book, Emmanuel, subtitled Levinas and Variations on God with Us. So thank you for joining me on this live stream in a new location than where I usually record from. So for Levinas, let's start with the philosophy of Levinas. The ethical is always primary, and he makes it clear that his notion of expiation for the other is not a manifestation of the sacred. He's very clear about that. And just like his colleague Paul Ricoeur, who says, I am frightened by this word sacred. Levinas says in his book Totality and Infinity, to relate to the absolute as an atheist is to welcome the absolute purified of the violence of the sacred. It's a very careful thing he says here. This is not a kind of ideology of atheism. It's not a lazy atheism. It's not even atheism per se. It's a paradoxical, hyperbolic way of speaking. So Levinas is thinking about the philosophical concept of the absolute, which is what philosophy is after. A kind of thing, not necessarily object or even idea per se, but something very closely related to the infinite, the absolute, that which cannot be divided into parts anymore. The ultimate for thought, in other words, a thought that thinks more than itself. So Levinas says to relate to the absolute as an atheist, we could also read the absolute as divinity. To relate to the absolute as an atheist is to welcome the absolute purified of the violence of the sacred. So the word absolute is helpful for philosophy because it's signaling a very apophatic via negativa in relation to every other concept. To say the absolute is to say like the otherwise than everything else, the elsewhere in relation to the here, the alterity of Dasein to the nth degree. So what Levinas is getting at is to relate to this very powerful, elusive, incomprehensible in itself concept of the absolute. One must approach it with a kind of atheism in regard to idolatry, an atheism of the idol. So when Levinas uses the language of sacred, what he means here is precisely a kind of lapse of the ethical. And to say sacred for Levinas is to imply some kind of nearby, at least, idolatry. So the concept of the absolute evades all idols. Every idol is precisely not the absolute. So one has to be an atheist in regarding any concept of the absolute, also divinity or infinity, that empties this elusiveness itself of its um, mystery, of its hiddenness, of its fundamental incomprehensibility. So he says further in totality and infinity, in the dimension of height in which his sanctity, this is his separation, is presented, the infinite does not burn the eyes that are lifted unto him. So he's talking about God. Yes, he's talking about divinity. So to say you have to be an atheist in relation to God is not to say you don't believe in God, but you don't believe in the reification of the idol that is eclipsing God. And it's a constant paradox here because the moments we say we have God, it's exactly in that moment we do not have God. So God, the absolute, the infinite, that itself for Levinas is untethered from the sacred, involves a kind of apophatic atheism, in as much as we're saying, whenever we say this is God, at the same time we're saying this is not God. And we're letting God alone speak well of God through the intersubjective ethical relationship between the other and oneself. So again, in the dimension of height, we hear the language of height in Levinas, it means ethics, ethics of responsibility. Then the dimension of height, also transcendence, in which his sanctity, so it's not saying its sanctity, his sanctity is a personal kind of pronoun here in reference to a personalized absolute, a personalized divinity. His separation is presented. The infinite does not burn the eyes that are lifted unto him. So God is so transcendent in relation to the creature that God does the creature a favor by remaining so transcendent. Because if God did not hide himself, so to speak, we would be obliterated in an instant. Who else made the sun and all the billions of stars that populate the universe? And if something like even a bonfire, a little fire, it could be harmful to a human person, how much more so the immense power, the unspeakable power of the creator of every power, of everything. And so God's divinity and his transcendence allows the creature to approach him. And that this divinity, understood by Levinas, approaches the creature in and through one's fellow man, one's fellow human being. The call of the other is the trace of the divine. He speaks. He does not have the mythical format that is impossible to confront and would hold the eye in its invisible meshes. He is not numinous, the eye who remains separated and keeps its as for me. So Levinas, in this, we could say a negative theology, not in the sense of lacking or bad, but an ongoing critique of idolatry reification of the divine in the creature, an emptying of transcendence into immanence, an emptying of ethical into the mythical discourse, an emptying of invisibility into visibility. Levinas says, no, divinity, the absolute, the infinite, is something quite different. And we make contact with divinity through ethical responsibility, one for the other. In his book, Difficult Freedom, Levinas writes, the rigorous affirmation of human independence, of its intelligent presence to an intelligible reality, the destruction of the numinous concept of the sacred. All this entails the risk of atheism, but it's not some political ideology, and it's not even a reductionistic kind of sense of atheism. Again, it's an atheistic theism is what Levinas is talking about. It's entirely paradoxical, but necessary. To believe is to renounce the direct comprehensibility of divinity. To believe well involves a recurring atheistic moment within the process, within the dramatics of belief. So, in the end, it's not that Levinas doesn't believe in God, but he believes in a God that he does not invent himself. He does not manipulate for his own selfish advantage in the world. But it is a desert quest to seek the panim, the face of Hashem, of the name, that is signified in the proximity of the neighbor, of the stranger. So yes, very much influenced by Judaism completely, this understanding of ethical monotheism. But this risk of atheism, so to speak, must be run, he says. Only through it can man be raised to the spiritual notion of the transcendent. It is a great glory for the Creator to have set up a being who affirms him after having contested and denied him in the glamorous areas of myth and enthusiasm. So Levinas is saying, in the end, the creature affirms divinity, yes, believes, but only in and through a history of idolatry, and therefore the requisite atheism, as we revisit these idols or they're presented to us in new ways, in every form of the sacred, for Levinas, that is then transposed into mythology, religious zeal, enthusiasm, fervor, even frenzy. Levinas, like Ricoeur, is frightened by the word sacred because it can result in irrationality. It can result in the suspension of the ethical, as we see in Soren Kierkegaard in his interpretation of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac by Abraham. For Levinas, he brings us back to the sobriety of rational religion, not rationalism, rational revelation in the form of ethical signification. It's as if to say we can't go wrong with this kind of ethics as first philosophy. We know what is rational based on the question, what is good for my neighbor? What is genuinely good, authentically good, comprehensively good for my neighbor, not destructive, good, to promote his or her well-being. It is a great glory, he says, for God to have created a being capable of seeking him or hearing him from afar, having experienced separation and atheism. So belief in God is entirely victorious when it passes through the shadows of atheism, a belief that is tried and tested, a contest to believe, not an easy, comfortable belief that is experienced as a self-insulation by the sacred. So for Levinas, it is a rigorous faith, not a manifestation of the sacred. It's an ethical, atheistic monotheism, very paradoxical. So yes, he means belief, but it is the belief in the dark night of faith, an ethical faith. To give oneself in loving responsibility for the sake of the other is not a modality of manifestation, but an ethical act performed through the frankness and resoluteness of intersubjective dialogue. Further, in his an interview featured in Joe Robbins' book, Is It Righteous to Be?, Levinas contends that for religion, and primarily for Christianity, the ethical appears to be only an approach, a beginning, where the religious stands over the ethical. So he's critiquing Christianity here from a Jewish perspective, of course, but also a philosophical argument is being made. For thinking, he says, the sacred appears in Christianity as something which stands in essence higher and belongs to the metaphysical. I believe, on the other hand, he says, that the ethical is the spiritual itself, and that there is nothing that surpasses the ethical. The surpassing of the ethical is precisely the beginning of all violence. So, when we hear this quote, we think of the implicit critique therein of Kierkegaard and his suspension of the ethical in the name of religious faith. For example, in Kierkegaard's book, Fear and Trembling. So Levinas has essays where he contests Kierkegaard on this point and gives a much more nuanced interpretation of the Genesis narrative of the Abraham binding his son Isaac, but then coming back to the ethical monotheism, where there's an unbinding of Isaac and the sacrifice of the animal instead, and not his own son. So here, as in several other texts, Levinas draws a sharp contrast between the notions of immanence and transcendence, between totality and infinity, between contemplation and ethics, between incarnation and aleity. For Levinas, God is an immanent transcendence rather than a transcendent immanence, as in Christianity. In his book, Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence, Levinas writes, this transcendence of divinity is not convertible into immanence. So it's very interesting how Levinas thinks these concepts of transcendence and immanence. He refuses to allow transcendence to be emptied into immanence, which would be a reification of divinity in a creature, the reification of the infinite in the finite. But for Levinas, the infinite is not directly accessible for good reason. Within the realm of human experience, Levinas hears something which neither Husserl, nor Heidegger, nor Marion detected because perhaps they were too bedazzled by what manifests itself to vision. So Levinas hears something that these other thinkers don't hear because they're so preoccupied with a visual phenomenology of givenness and manifestation. and presence. Levinas hears the voice of the other and therein the voice of God. His phenomenology of the other is bound to a phenomenology of proclamation, which prioritizes speech above sight. Ethical exigency, as enacted through spoken discourse, humanizes humanity insofar as it empties all dehumanizing idols of their banal numinosity and their false pretenses to surpass the goodness inherent in the anthropological face-to-face ethical encounter. And we need to think of Nietzsche's Übermensch in all this, and how dehumanizing it can be when a person is convinced that the universe orbits around his or her ego. On guard against the idolatrous disclosure of truth, even as aletheia, that is, truth as non-concealment, Levinas' phenomenology is inspired by Torah, what he calls the book of anti-idolatry, the absolute opposite of idolatry. Torah, defined as instruction, law, and command, transpires through speech, recitation, rumination, and exegesis of text. Torah defies every idol by resisting the hypnosis of manifestation and its bedazzling mysterium fascinans et tremendum. It's saturating, fascinating, tremendous, terrifying mystery of the sacred in relation to the spoken word. Torah defies this idolatry of the sacred. Even more, Torah is enacted in daily ethical performance within interpersonal relationships that hinge on divine standards of justice. Levinas frequently describes Judaism as a religion for adults. For example, again in his book, Difficult Freedom. A religion for adults, a religion for mature people. Mature in as much as ethically bound people. Adults are the ones identified as those who recognize themselves as responsible for the other, responsible for the child, responsible for the poor and marginalized persons of society, responsible for the disabled person, and those who live in radical vulnerability and fragility. Mature adults have entered the stage of post-naivete through the sophistication and pedagogy of language and culture. Adults compose and interpret texts, recognizing human existence as taking place within a density of texts and interpretive layers of meaning. Centered on the phenomenality of proclamation, a theology of adulthood stands opposite a theology of childhood that stems from the primacy of manifestation. Okay, so to add a couple terms to our network of terms here, the work of Levinas we can characterize not only as a phenomenology of proclamation, but also what we could say is gives itself as a theology, emphasis on the logos of adulthood, whereas the work of Jean-Luc Marion, for example, gives itself to a theology, emphasis on the theos, on God, a theology of childhood. So we can think of this also in terms of this evolution of the method of phenomenology of manifestation, the contemplative comportment of the young child. And then we have this phenomenology of proclamation, the ethical disposition of the adult. So we have a dialectic between all of this, the dialectics of contemplation and ethics, givenness and hermeneutics, childhood and adulthood, which covers the whole course of human development. So the difference between the work of Levinas and Marion. Levinas, Ricoeur, Derrida, Gadamer, Phenomenology of Proclamation. We have Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Jean-Luc, Marion, Edith Stein, Dietrich von Hildebrand, so many thinkers, phenomenology of manifestation, primarily. That goes back to Husserl. So we want to keep thinking of this distinction between theology of childhood versus theology of adulthood. And that's how we can approach different religious traditions and see the different forms of religious expression in each one, see their historical, cultural, gradual development, and the reform movements as they happen within various religious traditions. So I want to just think with Levinas and Marion a bit more leading up to this application to specific religious traditions, which we'll try to do in this live stream. So in contrast to Marion's phenomenology of givenness, and we could say theology of childhood, Levinas develops a phenomenology of the other and a theology of adulthood, scolding the idolatry of the sacred in the name of the one, the absolute, the infinite divinity proclaimed in the face of the other. Not manifest in the face of the other, proclaimed in the face of the other through the ethical call of the other. In order to understand the placement of Levinas' critique of the sacred, we need to first think about what is meant by a theology of childhood as revealed in the work of Jean-Luc Marion. Marion's entire oeuvre can be categorized properly as a theology of childhood, with its express emphasis on the theos rather than the logos within the term theology. Since givenness privileges the wonder and awe that we find in the perception of the child, the gaze of the child looking out at the world and receiving the world with an absorbent mind, as Maria Montessori has put it. As the one who lacks a highly developed vocabulary and symbolic order, the child most especially personifies the fitting disposition of the human subject in the face of the free and unmasterable phenomenon, phenomenological givenness. Unlike the adult, the child is the one most uninhibited by presuppositions and biases, by the natural attitude. The child brackets the natural attitude perfectly because she doesn't have one yet. So it's a very good phenomenological situation for the child who receives this world of givenness with such innocence and what Hildegard of Bingen calls viridity, the greenness of being, the greenness of all that gives itself within lived experience. Fresh, perennially new, interesting, worthy of contemplation. As the one who lacks a highly developed vocabulary and symbolic order, the child, unlike the adult, is the one most uninhibited by the natural attitude. The child, unlike the adult, does not view that which appears through calloused interpretive lenses. In Marion's phenomenological world, the child would be the quintessential representative of counter-intentionality and openness of intuition. The child's world is much more saturated than the adult's world because the child does not place limits on what may or may not appear. The child's world is a world of grand possibilities. It contains fewer obstacles for love, fewer experiences of betrayal, of hurt, of crustaceous ideology. Marion writes in his book Prolegomena to Charity that love opens the eyes, not in the way violence opens the eyes of the disabused, but as a child opens his eyes to the world, or a sleeper opens his eyes to the morning. A child's experience is charged with openness, mystery, and surprise. A child does not calculate and predetermine what may or may not occur in her lived experience. Rather, the child approaches life with a natural sense of fascination and affinity toward beauty, order, and magnificence. Love is the hermeneutic key to behold the world as a child. Since love melts away the hermeneutic apprehensiveness, which would drain the phenomenon of its immaculate autonomy of self-revelation. For Marion, love serves as the insufficient reason to see and to act. In his book, The Erotic Phenomenon, Marion writes, "When loving is at issue, reason is not sufficient. Reason appears from this point forward. Being toward love, this lifestyle of love, reason appears as insufficient reason rather than this principle of sufficient reason, which tended to dominate philosophy for so many centuries." So Marion in his work is upending the principle of sufficient reason. Levinas is also doing something similar in some ways, not in the same ways. But both Levinas and Marion issue a critique of subjective self-sufficiency. Levinas calls this counter-consciousness. Marion calls it counter-intentionality. Love in the work of Marion is that which inspires the authentic theologian for whom the referent of theology is not taught, since it is encountered by mystical union. We see how different, that's a quote from Marion's book, God Without Being. We see how different the discourse is in Marion and Levinas when it comes to religious experience. In Marion's view, authentic theology is that which peels away all hermeneutic filters in order to attain the purest mystical encounter with divinity. In the final analysis, divine revelation is not a matter of human investigation and contribution, but depends entirely on letting the divine manifest divinity to the human subject, considered as pure recipient of divine gift, in a word, grace. So yes, Marion's work, his concepts, and his philosophy, and then as applied to theology, are very much influenced by Catholicism, Catholic Christianity, very sacramental, mystical, contemplative ethos. When applied to theology, the perception of the child serves as the premier mise en scène upon which the phenomenon may show itself by itself without qualification or limitation. The child exhibits the genius of wonder and the propensity for the beautiful and the sacred. This is what is meant by a theology of childhood that we see in the work of Jean-Luc Marion. In contrast with his accents on frank discourse and ordinary ethical movements, Levinas chides the notion of the sacred and the naivete of the child's worldview. If responsibility is the key term for Levinas' lifelong project to establish ethics as first philosophy, it is the adult who is the responsible one. Levinas develops what can be called a theology, emphasis on the logos in the term theology, a theology of adulthood, because the accent is on language, speech, and ethical signification. For Levinas, the divine is proclaimed in the human through ethical action, not through an incarnate manifestation of divine presence. In a 1984 interview with Solomon Malka, Levinas says, contrary to what my friend Derrida says, philosophy is not a subject matter for children of preschool age or in the first grade. Philosophy and theology are fields for Levinas which require the developmental competence to recognize and rise to the place of responsibility for the other. The vocation to responsibility is a mission for the mature, for adults who have been initiated into the election of virtue and responsibility. Adulthood is ushered in by bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, to become a son or daughter of the law, through which a child becomes an adult within this believing community, ethical community. Quoting his teacher Shoshani, Levinas quips that one should not give steak to newborns. Infants and children are incapable of becoming responsible for the other to the degree that an adult is. Infants and children are instead those for whom adults are responsible. In his 1963 Talmudic reading entitled Toward the Other, Levinas writes that decidedly within Judaism we are dealing with a religion of adults. The Jewish law is intended for adults who are able to perceive it, understand it, and respond to it. Through dialectical discussion and debate, the logos of reason comes of age when we recognize our responsibility for and serve the other without not risk to the self. Not without risk to the self. In his book Difficult Freedom, Levinas writes that for a long time, Jews thought that every situation in which humanity recognizes its religious progress finds in ethical relations its spiritual meaning. That is to say, its meaning for an adult. Ethics is a territory of adulthood, and theological reflection on the spirituality of ethical action is a task suited to adults. In the same text, Difficult Freedom, Levinas goes on to say that the adult's God is revealed precisely through the void of the child's heaven. This is the moment when God retires from the world and hides his face. This condition reveals a God who renounces all aids to manifestation and appeals instead to the full maturity of the responsible man. End quote. One ascends into the state of adulthood as the fondness of the child's world of manifestation fades away through the experience of the tragic and the iron discipline of self-mastery. The word of God is issued not through the manifestation of a numinous presence for Levinas, but through righteous and just living for the other. For Levinas, a God revealed in manifestation perpetuates an arrested development of the human spirit, which only lives in the imago Dei, the image of God, to the extent that it assumes responsibility for the other. Levinas again draws a serious contrast between the mystical sacred and the sober Torah, as he writes, again in his book, Difficult Freedom. Here, I believe we see the specific face of Judaism. The link between God and man is not an emotional communion that takes place within the love of a God incarnate, as we have in Christianity, but a spiritual or intellectual relationship which takes place through an education in the Torah. It is precisely a word not incarnate from God that ensures a living God among us. Torah is a protection against the madness of a direct contact with the sacred that is unmediated by reason. And here we find Levinas referring to the Nazi horror. these adults who grew up on catechisms, both Protestant and Catholic, perpetrated this mass murder of especially Jewish people. 6 million Jewish men, women, and children murdered because of this hypnosis of the sacred, where ethics goes by the wayside. So Levinas is critiquing this fiercely, this claim of the creature to have a direct contact with the sacred, unmediated by reason. He says this will spawn violence, this will spawn terrorism. We see it in every religious tradition around the world, where there's a movement led by this sense of um, uh, this all-pervasive sacred that results in fanaticism and fundamentalism, extremism. So Levinas' critique is very much leveled at this notion of direct contact with the sacred. What is to fear in contacting the sacred in a way unmediated by reason? Levinas warns us that such enthusiasm quickly leads to dehumanizing activity. When the ethical is suspended, so is the human, so is the divine. A theology which respects the transcendence of God refuses to manipulate the divine as a mode of human affectivity. The radical otherness of God is maintained through the unflinching demands of the divine law, which binds the human person through rational assent to the inherent and transcendent goodness of this law and of righteous living. So, religious belief for Levinas is not emotionalism. It's not attachment to affections of the sacred. It's not mystical transports at all. It's an entirely different kind of ecstasy, the ecstasy of the ethical, where there is an exodus made of the self outside of itself in direction to the other who faces the self. A theology of adulthood prevents an irrational Dionysian affair with the sacred, which would result in a destruction of self, other, and community. A theology that is rational ensures that the rectitude of God's eternal law will continue to unfold within the terrain of humanity. This is what is meant by a theology of adulthood that we find in the work of Levinas. So that now that we've gotten some indication about the phenomenological polarity between the work of Jean-Luc Marion and Emmanuel Levinas, let us in turn propose the next step for interreligious dialogue in the 21st century. Instead of recommending either Marion's or Levinas's theology of childhood or adulthood, respectively, I would like to suggest a new dialectical theology of ethical communal personhood. I do not intend to synthesize the respective positions of Marion and Levinas through a Hegelian sublation of difference into a third position of totality, but rather to bring these two positions in closest proximity in order to harness the fruitfulness of the dialectical tension between them. This procedure, in fact, is precisely what Levinas recommends in his Talmudic understanding of truth. By affirming the veracity of both poles of the dialectic, fertile conversation is advanced without breakdown. So I term this proposal a theology of ethical personhood, ethical communal personhood, since both theos and logos in the concept of theology receive emphasis, and since both childhood and adulthood are validated as necessary hermeneutic vectors to the phenomenon. My argument is that there is an intrinsic complementarity between childhood and adulthood, between the experience of the child and the experience of the adult. While children are called to the maturity of adulthood, adults are likewise called to the innocence and perceptive openness and maturity, contemplative maturity of children. Are not children creatures of love par excellence? Both children and adults are persons in the full sense of the term, and therefore to speak of a theology of ethical, communal personhood suggests the primacy of relationality within a matrix of otherness. So how might this newly devised method I'm suggesting of a dialectical phenomenology of manifestation and proclamation, of contemplation and ethics, of givenness and hermeneutics, of childhood and adulthood, how would this work as applied in the field of interreligious dialogue? First, let's have an experiment. Let's think about Judaism and Christianity. So already we've detected a contrast between Judaism and Christianity in the two thinkers, Levinas, who represents Judaism, and Jean-Luc Marion represents Catholicism, Catholic Christianity. While Judaism professes an aperture of proclamation, Christianity reveals one of manifestation, especially in Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. The more ancient, original forms of Christianity have this rich tradition of sacramentality, mysticism, contemplation. And so we get this emphasis of givenness within a Eucharistic framework of religious expression, where the gift is the centerpiece. As witnessed in Levinas, though, Judaism constantly defends the transcendent otherness of God, who is revealed through the law of the covenant, the Mosaic Torah. All forms of idolatry are condemned by the prophets and lambasted in the name of the Lord, Ha-Adonai Hashem, who is above all nomenclature and representation. So for the Jewish people, they don't say the sacred name of God out loud, abbreviated by the Tetragrammaton, YHWH. I also don't say this name out loud out of respect for the Jewish community and the whole Judeo-Christian tradition. I think it's a wonderful practice that there is this name of God that is so transcendent, we don't give utterance to it. We recognized its trace in the text, but we say instead, Ha-Adonai, the Lord, or Hashem, the name. Christianity, on the other hand, began as a sort of reform movement within Judaism. Jesus, after all, is Jewish, much more so than Christian. Jesus is Jewish, his mother Miriam is Jewish, his father Joseph is Jewish, his adopted father Joseph, and all the 12 apostles are Jewish. The church begins as a reform movement of Judaism, it's very clear, but Judaism gives rise to Christianity, but Christianity is distinct from Judaism in its announcement of an epiphany of God, a theophany of the divine, which overturned the lordship of legislation, you could say. And so in Jesus Christ, there is an incarnation of Torah in the flesh. And we have this very careful relationship that ensues between transcendence and immanence. in the person of Jesus. And this is what Levinas is concerned about with Christianity, that transcendence is no longer transcendence because of the emphasis of immanence, the immanence of the sacred, the inbreaking of God in the here and now, in the sacraments, in the church, in mystical life of prayer. And Levinas is concerned about what might happen to ethics in all of this and the ethical imperatives of responsibility for the other. Because for Christians, the law of God has been manifested in the flesh in Jesus of Nazareth, who is regarded as the Lord, as we read in the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, Logos. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And we saw his glory, the glory as of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. So this language in the Gospel of John, going back to the Greek, is the language of manifestation, of incarnation, of flesh, of gift, of givenness, of grace. This is what we see predominating in Christianity. Protestant Christianity has an eruption of that proclamation happening. And I talk a lot more about this in my 2017 book, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist. But for now, I'm just trying to juxtapose Judaism and Christianity in more general terms. Because within Christianity, that we find both trajectories of manifestation and proclamation, with Protestant Christianity taking up the banner of proclamation. For example, with its fundamentalist basis in the Lutheran notion of sola scriptura, Protestantism in a way returns to the Jewish prominence of language, text, ethics, testimony, promises of God, eschatology, history, as opposed to liturgy, sacraments, and mysticism that we find in Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox Christianity. So this we can see is how we can apply the manifestation proclamation dialectic in trying to understand the difference between Judaism and Christianity, though Christianity is an outgrowth of Judaism. There's no separation between the two to make any sense of Christianity. The roots of Christianity remain forever in Judaism. What about Islam? What about Islam? Thinking about comparative theology and interreligious dialogue. With its concentration on the textual vitality of the Quran, Islam, like Judaism, can be situated as a religion of proclamation. As Levinas writes in his book, Difficult Freedom, again, monotheism marks a break with a certain conception of the sacred. It neither unifies nor hierarchizes the numerous and numinous gods. Instead, it denies them. So the contrast between Judaism as a monotheism and all these ancient polytheistic religions. So in the Arabian Peninsula, Islam is born with the Prophet Muhammad, who's contending with all of these polytheistic systems of faith around him. And he's very much persecuted because of his insistence in monotheism. Levinas says further about monotheism as regards the divine, which the polytheistic religions incarnate. Monotheism is understood as atheism. So this is true in the history of religion, that polytheistic communities would regard monotheistic ones as atheists because they don't believe in the pantheon and all of these various deities. And even in early Christianity, the same was true in the context of Roman mythology. Roman polytheism, Christians were regarded as atheists. They don't believe in the gods. So Islam is a similar phenomenon in the 7th century in the Arabian Peninsula with the Prophet Muhammad. Both Judaism and Islam can be defined as atheistic belief structures in regard to deities expressed in polytheistic avatars and incarnations. The preeminence of prophetism in both Judaism and Islam signals the word of the other, in particular, the word of God announced in the self of the prophet, and especially in the self's response to this divine summons. Even though Islam can be situated as a religion of proclamation, it, like Judaism, has a mystical trajectory within it, namely Sufism. Through its developed symbolic structures of meaning, Sufism introduces mysticism in the Islamic tradition for the sake of its goal, communion with God through the pathway or the tariqah of ecstatic contemplation, vajid. Although this mystical itinerary seems close to the notion of manifestation in Christian mysticism or Kabbalah in Jewish mysticism, Sufism insists that it is dealing with an awakening to the unmanifest or unseen world, Kashf al-Ghayab. So when we do this survey and phenomenological description of different religious traditions, we can see the general patterns. We can recognize the general patterns of religious expression. So what I've said so far is to say that Judaism and Islam are more religious traditions of proclamation. Christianity is more of a religious tradition of manifestation in general terms. But we get the exceptions to the rule in both, though they are globally the minority of adherents in the traditions, where you have a kind of mystical current in the theology of proclamation of Judaism or Islam, or you have a charismatic current within the overall manifestation theology of Christianity and Protestant Reform Christianity. So what we tend to see in religious traditions is reform movements, typically in the direction of proclamation, because it's a pruning of the accoutrements of manifestation. When manifestation gets too busy, too saturating, too mystical, we have reform movements that bring manifestation back into discourse, ethics, interpretation, and keep it on the rational plane, so it doesn't become that Dionysian intoxication of the sacred, which can quickly become irrational. How about Hinduism and Buddhism and Shintoism? I'll just deal with these. So Hinduism, in contrast to Judaism and Islam, but similar to Christianity, asserts a proliferation and multiplicity of divine manifestations, avatars of divinity. There's Brahman, but there's the manifestation of divinity through Shiva, Vishnu, Lakshmi, all of these various manifestations of divinity that each have their own shrine in the Hindu temple. So a countless host of divine avatars, Krishna, Rama, Parvati, Shakti, Kali, Lakshmi, derived from the three primary manifestations of Brahman, namely Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. In Hinduism, the divine is worshipped in a plethora of manifestations, which are taken to be diverse embodiments of the divine. Through the saturating variety of aspects, descents, and personifications of divinity, through a very mythological narrative, um, we have believers drawing near to the deity for various needs and causes. The Vedas, for example, speak of the thousand-headed Brahman and of the oneness of truth called by many different names. In his book, The Rhythm of Being, Raimondo Panikar writes that this Hindu principle of Advaita overcomes the strictures of positing the logos to integrate the pneuma or spirit in our approach to reality. So the Advaita intuition is a very paradoxical religious sense in Hinduism, in which um, there's an integration of logos and pneuma, we could say, from the Greek concepts of ratio or logic, reason, and spirit. Spiritual knowledge, he says, that does not need rational evidence in order to gain an insight into the nature of things. So we have that more language of the sense of the sacred there in Hinduism, and this theology of manifestation. Advaita amounts to the overcoming of dualistic dialectics by means of introducing love at the ultimate level of reality, aduality. Reality is not one, reality is not two. That's the meaning of Advaita, non-duality of reality. So unity of reality, though there's the manifestation of the source of this unity, Brahman, a manifestation of Brahman, through various avatars. So Hinduism um, can come across as a kind of polytheism. It can be understood as polytheism, but it also could be understood as a plurality of divinity self-revelation through the various avatars, yet altogether claiming the non-duality of reality, uh, unity of Advaita. So this is Hinduism, and likewise the Vedas depict God as becoming the creation. For Hinduism, the goal of faith is moksha, that is spiritual ascent, called dharma, and eventual union with Brahman. So we see what happens in these theologies of manifestation, just like Neoplatonism, for example, and the Aeneids of Plotinus. There's a movement of the many to the one. There's a dissolution of the many into the one, an absorption of the many into the one. Manifestation runs like this. Every mysticism has these kind of motifs, tropes, connotations. Whereas this theology of proclamation that we're seeing in Judaism, Islam, and I'm about to talk about Buddhism, we have a refusal of the closure of the dialectic that involves plurality, alterity, otherness, dialogue, discourse, and these religious traditions are going to be codified more so in texts in their interpretation. Not that the theologies of manifestation don't have their texts. They do have their texts, but it's like the texts are there to prescind from them and to move toward that union with divinity that uh, uh, Hinduism, for example, calls moksha. Um, whereas the theologies of proclamation um, resist the nearby idols of manifestation within religious experience by concentrating so much on the textuality of religious belief and practice. So, just a little more on Hinduism, and then I want to talk about how Buddhism is a reform movement of Hinduism. So, in Hinduism, the dynamic of manifestation is so prominent that oftentimes there's little demarcation between the divine and the universe, resulting in an essentially pantheistic perception of reality, as seen in the principle of Advaita or non-dualism. And this is why in Hindu practice, there's honor for various animals, and eating certain foods, not eating other ones. There's the belief in reincarnation, because there's a understanding of the Atman, the soul is very fluid within the ubiquity of reality. This Advaita, this non-dualistic way of understanding the relationship between transcendence and immanence, for example. In Hinduism, we have a unity of the concepts to the degree that um, there can ensue a kind of pantheistic sensibility. Ornate and intricate mandalas depict a refulgence of divine emanation, which constitutes the cosmos in Hinduism. The doctrine of reincarnation reinforces the unity and totality of the cosmos, in which all beings comprise an organic whole. So, what I'm trying to do through phenomenology is trace the logic of these various religious traditions, forms of religious expression around the world, in very limited ways with this English language, and me living in the United States and having my own context of lived experience and history and culture. But nevertheless, what I'm interested in is the dialogue, trying to understand the religious other vis-a-vis myself, and trying to work toward um, a unity of humanity around the common good, trying to contribute to um, this um common task we have. And so I think interreligious dialogue is vital in our time. It's a difficult enterprise. But again, sharing some excerpts from my 2021 book, Emmanuel, subtitled Levinas and Variations on God with Us, where the chapter one is getting into interreligious dialogue a bit. So it's already interreligious dialogue for me, in that as a Catholic Christian, I am very interested in the work of Levinas, a Jewish philosopher and believer, because, of course, I understand the roots of Christianity to be Judaism. But even beyond Judaism, I want to think about these other religions of the world that have their respective uh, geocentric histories, um, in terms of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula, Hinduism, Buddhism in India, uh, Asia, Southeast Asia, and Judaism, Christianity, the Middle East, spread quickly to Europe, Africa, eventually the Americas, and Australia. And of course, all of these various indigenous religious traditions around the world. It's fascinating territory to study. But I think phenomenology is a great method to help us in these investigations and explorations of the plurality and diversity of religious traditions around the world. So, Buddhism, like Protestantism within Christianity, Buddhism can be interpreted as a reform movement within Hinduism, which moves away from an obsession with the sacred toward a concentration on text and ethical behavior. Buddhism, then, is fundamentally a religion of proclamation, initiated by Siddhartha Gautama in the 6th century BC, Buddhism turns attention away from the cosmological samsara, that is, the swirling cycles of death and rebirth, in order to break free from them through bodhi, that is, enlightenment, and to reach the final state of nirvana, that is, to extinguish, or literally to blow out, the fire of ignorance and desire which cause suffering, the meaning of nirvana. So instead of moksha as goal in Hinduism and unity with divinity, Buddhism is a more apophatic, uh, it's an apophaticism of the apophaticism of Hinduism, become a kind of charismatic proclamation of a liberation of suffering through um, bodhi, enlightenment, to result in nirvana, blowing out the fire of ignorance and desire, which causes suffering. So unity with divinity is not as much the goal of Buddhism as an evacuation of Advaita, the non-dualism, the ubiquity of reality, which includes in itself suffering. However, two divergent movements emerged within Buddhism: Theravada Buddhism, which adheres to the values of proclamation in an almost exclusive way, and then Mahayana Buddhism, which demonstrates a preoccupation with the captivating sacred. For example, in the worship of bodhisattvas, the deities, or even the ancestors as kind of reified avatars of divinity. So even within Buddhism itself, which is led by this theology of proclamation, we have a manifestation strain breaking back into it in the Mahayana tradition and of the bodhisattvas. Chan, Zen, and Tibetan Buddhism all stem from the manifestation paradigm of Mahayana Buddhism. On the whole, however, it is accurate to understand Buddhism as a reform movement within Hinduism, moving away from the religious form of manifestation to that of proclamation. So the Bhagavad Gita, the attunement to the textuality of the religious practice and the hermeneutics in Buddhism, it's in the study involved, the discourses, the interpretation, the histories of discourse. This is something different than the history of the avatars of divinity that is predominant in Hinduism. So just as Christianity is a reform movement and of Judaism, moving from proclamation to manifestation, we have the opposite, as Buddhism is a reform movement of Hinduism, a movement from manifestation to proclamation. So on the whole, as one Hindu believer, Ramaswamy Sharma of Parma, Ohio, who I got a chance to meet some years ago, has put it, Buddhism is Hinduism minus God. So that's so interesting. Buddhism is Hinduism minus God, because there's an atheism that comes through the intensification of proclamation on guard against every idolatry of the sacred in Buddhism. So indeed, Buddhism, original Buddhism, can be construed as an atheistic belief structure in relation to the panoply of divine manifestations, which make up Hinduism. So yes, Hindu believers will look at Buddhist believers and say they're atheists. They don't believe in the avatars of Brahman. They don't visit the shrines, offer sacrifices, and so they're atheists. But we see underneath these patterns of religious belief and practice are those inherent proclivities of manifestation and proclamation that we see in the history of the phenomenological movement of philosophy itself, and thereby this movement of philosophy helps us to understand the histories of world religions through a very, yes, scientific, as Husserl said, field of neutral researches that begins with bracketing the natural attitude, receiving all givenness and signification within the lived experience, and then describing it. It's a fantastic way to do comparative theology. Finally, how about the place of Japan? Shintoism. In Shintoism, a religion indigenous to Japan, this certainly can be placed in the school of manifestation, like Hinduism, with its practices of ancestor veneration and belief in kami, which are sacred spirits that are said to exist in everything and are revered as deities. So we have a kind of pantheistic sensibility in Shintoism also, with its preponderance of manifestation. One such kami is the venerated Amaterasu, a sun goddess who gives sacred authority to the emperor. Therefore, the national emperor is revered by the people of the nation as a man who has been commissioned directly by the divine to rule. With its diverse array of jinja, or shrines dedicated to kami, the structure of Shintoism clearly follows the contours of manifestation rather than proclamation. Shintoism envisions an infinite pantheon of deities which oversee all aspects of nature and human life. A fundamental part of Japanese life is to make offerings to kami at shrines and temples or at sacred sites, for example, at streams or mountains. Shintoism claims that human beings become kami after they die, joining the ranks of the nature spirits which animate the universe. This idea of deification is similar to that within Hinduism and that of manifestation within Christianity, which holds an eschatological teleology of the divinization of the human soul. So we see things in common between the different religious traditions and points of contrast. But overall, I think it's incredibly helpful to review various religious traditions in terms of the manifestation, proclamation, dialectic of religious belief and practice. That we see even in the method of phenomenology itself. So, this very brief outline of some of the world's great religious traditions shows the value of the phenomenological relationship between manifestation and proclamation, especially as articulated in the confrontation of the works of Jean-Luc Marion and Emmanuel Levinas. And this critical phenomenological basis can serve as a foundation for interreligious dialogue today. It sets the standard for an unresolved dialectic enacted in respectful conversation, while furnishing key categories for understanding the fundamental relationships between diverse religious traditions and the reform movements within them. This insight may very well be a real breakthrough for the task of interreligious dialogue today. So the hypothesis advanced here must continue to be developed, tested through various interreligious encounters, but at least for now leaves us with great hope and promise for conversations of peace and mutual respect among us human beings who represent a vast array of religious traditions around the world, that we might become, as William James said, these happy warriors of dialogue. And the question, why not? To quote William James again, who says, why not be the happy warrior, willing to listen to all, struggle with and for all, help all to hear the other voices than the self. It's a beautiful quote from William James, I think, especially applicable to interreligious dialogue. So again, we think of the steps that we take with Jean-Luc Marion in his Phenomenology of Manifestation, Emmanuel Levinas' his Phenomenology of Proclamation, and a dialectical phenomenology of both, of all of the above, as we approach different religious traditions with great reverence, respect, open ears, open hearts, and an ethical will to live in love and responsibility for the other who faces me. So thank you so much for joining me in this live stream. If you're not already a subscriber, I invite you to be a subscriber. I have a link in the description to my Amazon author page where you can find more books on these topics. Again, today taken from my 2021 book, Emmanuel, subtitled Levinas and Variations on God with Us. So thank you so much. May we continue to think toward the whole, to pray from the heart, and to live as a witness. We'll see you in the next one.